Think about it.
Hey there, this is Seth Juarez. We're here at Ignite 2015, and I thought I'd get on stage and sneak in some dev stuff at a mostly IT Pro conference. You think they'll bum rush us a little bit?
This will be good.
No, this will be good.
So let's introduce ourselves and tell us a little bit about what you do. This is all things web at Microsoft, so we'll start over here.
Cool. My name is Brady Gaster. I am a PM on the VS Web Tools team. I work on the Azure tools.
Nice.
So if you do right-click publish, or you're using API apps, or you're using the web stuff in the Server Explorer, that's my team.
Fantastic.
Yes.
My name is Mads Christensen, and I work on the same team almost as Brady. Build the web tools in Visual Studio. So all the HTML and CSS, some of the JavaScript, less Sass, CoffeeScript, and now React.js, the JSX editor that we're introducing. And all sorts of other things, BrowserLink, and basically the toolkit for web developers for them to build websites.
Got it.
Yeah.
I'm Pranav Rastogi, and I'm a program manager on the ASP.NET team with Mads and Brady. So I own sort of the runtime bits a little bit, so around ASP.NET Identity, which is the membership system, like templates, the getting started experience. I also have the Redis cache service that we have in Azure, which everybody should use too.
Yeah. So let's start. We're doing all things web. Let's start with actually building a website. What are we doing in Visual Studio to help that?
Well, we're doing a lot of things this time. So one thing is what we're doing on the runtime side, which is like an important part of that with the ASP.NET 5, which is a brand new stack for building ASP.NET web applications using. And it's cross-platform, so you can build it on a Mac and or Linux and deploy it to Mac or Linux as well, right? Which is really, really cool. What that does is that it we kind of need to have the tools that we normally have in Visual Studio work on a Mac and Linux.
That's right.
All of a sudden, because that would be very helpful. So the entire team, no matter platform, they can use the same code and they can use the same tools. And so what we've done in Visual Studio is that we've created a layer on top of some industry standard tools, such as the package managers, Bower and NPM, to bring in client-side frameworks, jQuery and CSS Bootstrap and so on, but also like actual tooling that runs on Node.js in the background. And we use NPM for that. And that means that now we can start using tooling that comes from the Node.js world within Visual Studio. So Grunt and Gulp, for instance, to run all sorts of tasks like bundling and minification and compiling of less Sass, CoffeeScript, and that sort of stuff. And that lives in our project. That means that you can check that into source control, and your other team member sits on a Mac and Sublime Text maybe, with a console. They will now be able, those two people will now be able to work on the exact same code base using the exact same compilers and all this sort of stuff. And so that's really exciting that we now have portability on the tooling side too.
You know what? And the thing that I like the most is we didn't say, oh, that's really cool, let's make something like that.
Yes.
Instead we said, hey, that's really cool, let's just use that.
Well, it's a little bit more than that.
Let's hear it.
That's really cool, and those different features, like they're based on Node.js, right? They have huge ecosystems.
Yeah.
They already exist, like thousands and thousands of developers use this. And that means that there are huge ecosystems of all the packages and different tasks that we can use to compile our stuff, right? That already exists, so we wanted to tap into that. So Visual Studio can now tap into that existing huge community.
Wow.
But we wanted to make it work in a way that was felt natural to Visual Studio users. Because traditionally, what people do with these tools is that they use the command line.
Right.
And we wanted something where Visual Studio would just understand what goes on and build it into like your natural workflow. So your muscle memory stays intact. You don't have to learn like new command line and new syntaxes or anything like that. It just feels natural. So it's important that we just didn't say, okay, let's just use these tools. It's let's use them, but that improve the user experience on top of them.
So is this like a, hey, we're going to build hooks into it, or are we actually using the XEs that they supply?
We're using the actual XEs. So Visual Studio wraps it all nicely in. It kind of just feels natural. But under the hood, all Visual Studio is doing is to act like a proxy between you and the command line. So Visual Studio is calling the exact same command line, XEs and so on.
That's remarkable.
That you would if you use the command line. That means that you can use Visual Studio for maybe just for part of it and then stick to the command line for the rest, if that's what you want. You can have Visual Studio to handle everything, so you never have to use the command line. Or you can say, I don't want Visual Studio to do anything. I'm happy on the command line. I want to stay there. At the end of the day, it's the exact same thing. that's going to happen, the exact same commands
That's
that are being
cool.
executed.
So let's get into like what is a traditional way a dev would build something using this approach? Let's just say they want to do a file new project. How would you do that in Visual Studio using these new tools?
I would do it the exact same way I've always done. I would literally go in and say file new project. And if we do that, we already have you hooked up with both Bower and NPM and Gulp, which automate all these things and have the package managers. Everything is set up for you. And the only thing you have to do to, let's say you want a new package, you want, let's say, AngularJS.
Okay.
So instead of using NuGet, you can use Bower. The way you do that in Visual Studio is you open the bower.json file, and you add a line that says Angular. You get full IntelliSense. So Angular, and then what version you want. You save bower.json, and just by saving it, Visual Studio installs the package into your project.
That's awesome.
Right. Normally what you would do is that you would use some sort of scaffolding to say file new project if you use the command line.
Right.
And you would use the command line to install all these packages. But you didn't really get any IntelliSense, you didn't get any help, and it wasn't a Visual Studio experience.
Right.
So that's what we've been building in. And
That's awesome.
We've improved on it. So you get a full IntelliSense for the packages that exist on Bower.io, like the official registry. But you also get, like, if you hover the mouse over, it will tell you how many people downloaded the packages, who built the package. You get
That's cool.
additional metadata that's really helpful. Like, what's the license of this one package, for instance?
So it's really cool to be able to build a site really fast using all the good tools, but it doesn't do any good if it's on a local host. What are we doing to help people put it on Azure?
Oh, that's easy. What we're doing is we're always making the publishing tools a lot better. One of the things that you may have seen recently is we have this new really sexy portal. It's like all the touch screen and whatever else. So what we've done is we've taken some of the new APIs that back that portal, and we've started accessing those new APIs inside of ES. We're not completely done with it yet, but what we're doing is, rather than you have to go and make a site that lands in, let's say, some default West US type resource group, we've already added that ability inside of ES as of the 2.5.1 and 2.6 updates. So now you can create a whole new resource group inside of ES. You can create a new hosting plan inside of ES. Oh, that's fantastic. And one of the things that Mads talked about is how we're using things from the community to make the tooling better and make the Azure world better. One of the things that we've recently done is we've started using a package called Swashbuckle, which is actually contributed by Richie Morris, who actually lives in Seattle, great dev. And what he's done is he's written this package that you can, you just install the package, and it goes ahead and it wires everything up in your web API project, so that whenever you hit a particular URL, it's like /Swagger, you'll actually get the Swagger UI, and then there's another URL that you can hit that will give you the Swagger JSON. Why is that important? Because inside of ES recently, we've also added support for Azure API apps. So I could write a web API, we already add Swashbuckle to that project, and you deploy it, you can actually hit a URL inside of ES. What you would do is you would deploy everything, you would get that Swagger URL. You don't even have to know what it is, so I build my web API, I push it up to the cloud, and then I would say, add a new project to my solution, maybe a Windows Phone project, or a Universal App project, a Xamarin project, doesn't really matter. You would right-click that project and you would say Add Azure API Client, and it will ask you which one of those APIs you want to hit. You select it, then VS will go out, it will hit that Swagger URL, generate the code, drop it into your project, and now you've got strongly typed client code to be able to hit that API, versus new up an HTTP client, like parse everything, JSON, convert it to your own models. We give you all that. So it's almost like add service reference, or if you're old like me, add web reference from those days for REST APIs on top of web API, and basically anything that can run Swagger. One of the guys over in DX, Panos, recently built a sample API app using Node.js.
Got it. He
adds Swagger to it, and then I can use VS, hit that Swagger, and I can generate a .NET client to communicate with his Node.js backend. And basically, if you have an API that can expose Swagger, our tooling will generate the code for you. And we're going to take that a little bit further. Steve, that was on earlier, the guy that's PMing the whole Ag Connected Services, we're going to put a lot of that stuff in there, and we're going to take it even further.
That's awesome.
So eventually, if you're not even on Azure, you're going to have this functionality. We already have it today. You can basically take a raw Swagger file. You can add that, and it'll generate from the Swagger file versus your actual live API app. And we're going to obviously do more with that. We're going to harness the power of Swagger.
So what's the difference between Swagger and Swashbuckle? Maybe you can tell us a little bit about what Swagger actually is and what Swashbuckle does.
Swagger, well, you could probably do a better job of talking about that. Mads actually wrote the Swagger JSON schema. So
Let's do it.
I can
pretty into that.
speak to that. So Swagger is a format. So Remember the good old days? Add service
WSDL.
reference.
Yes.
SOAP, right? WSDL.
Yes.
WSDL was a description of what the API is.
Right.
What are the different endpoints, the URLs? Is it post and get, and what is what does the request look like, and will the
I
response look
know
like?
it was verbose, but boy, that made it a lot easier to connect to services.
Well,
Yes.
Swagger makes it easier in a smaller payload written in JSON.
So so think of it as the same thing,
Yeah.
but for JSON, and it's good for describing REST endpoint, not SOAP, but like just regular REST endpoint.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And what Swashbuckle is, it's technically just a NuGet package, and that NuGet package, when you add it to your Web API project, it just gives you a special URL in that Web API. Literally, it's /Swagger. When you hit that, you get that Swagger JSON. You don't have to manually handcraft it.
That's
so
awesome.
It'll generate it for you. And the same guy has actually been working with our buddy Glenn and some other guys on the VNext team to actually migrate Swashbuckle into the VNext world. So we're going to have that for you too.
So now that we've been able to build, deploy, and interact with Azure, sometimes things slow down when your site starts to become really good. What can we do to fix that? Tell us about Redis Cache.
Hey, so yeah, then you should cache all the information.
Cache all the things.
That's the solution for all problems.
That's right.
No. So, in a sort of a distributed world where you're building for Azure and deploying in Azure, it's very important that you have a caching layer. And the reason you want to have a caching layer in your app is traditionally getting data from a backend persistent store is slow.
Yeah.
And running queries on SQL Server or storage is slow. So you want to cache data which is stored in memory closer to your application, and in-memory retrievals of data are going to be much more faster. So that's why you just need a cache.
Right.
And you need distributed caches because when you start scaling out your web workloads to different instances, then you want a caching layer which can scale and handle all the nodes that have been scaled out. So you want to pick Redis Cache.
So how hard is it to actually enable caching inside of your ASP.NET application?
It's a matter of few minutes. It's not hard.
I know that's a loaded question because I actually did a demo with him, and I was like, all right, let's see how we set this up. And he gets in there, he's like, okay, I'm done. I'm like, well, we got to make this video a little longer. It's like a 30-second video.
You can slow it down.
Well, this is how you...
No, so you create a cache, and in Azure, we offer you the Redis Cache service as a service. And the reason we sort of picked up Redis Cache instead of sort of writing our own caching engine was, Redis is an open source caching platform.
Right.
It's very popular. It's been used by a lot of other sites like Twitter, Craigslist, Stack Overflow. And so we sort of looked around what the popular caching engines were, and we just offered Redis as a caching service in Azure. And
I don't think people realize that there's a lot of things you can cache, and there's probably some things you should cache. So for those that aren't caching, what should you be caching?
I think the general rule of thumb is that if you have data, it's read-only data, then you should cache. If you have data that the user is constantly accessing, you should cache that as well. So for example, give me the top 50 tweets for this user. You should cache it because the user is going to come often to that part of the site and sort of see that data. But you shouldn't cache your entire database because that's going to sort of impact the caching layer as well. So cache sort of the commonly used data as a best practice.
You talked about you also worked on membership. What people don't realize is there's certain things you should cache when it comes to, or you should put in the cache when it comes to identity.
Right. So that's a classic example of what do I store in my session, and that's an example of using the ASP.NET session provider, and then you can back it up with the Redis Cache as well. So most of the common things that people store is like what was my last login time, how many sessions do I have, or some sort of activity with your logged in user is something that you might want to consider storing it in the session layer.
And I think what people realize also, and this is something we talked about before, is if you're storing certain information in session and all of a sudden 1 million people hit your site and you're scaling to other machines, what happens to that session if you're not backing it up with cache?
Exactly. So if you store session in memory, then it's going to increase in size. Or if you store session in SQL, then you're going to talk to a SQL backend, get all this data. And as session grows, the amount of time it takes to get this data grows, and your site is going to slow down. So, do not store too much of data in session as well, and sort of offload it to another layer.
And the other thing is, if I'm logged in one VM, and then there's 5 VMs now, and now you're routed to another VM, if that session is in memory on that VM, you disappear.
Yes. And that's exactly why you need to have a distributed sort of store or a caching layer which solves this problem where you are scaling out your web workload in Azure to multiple VMs, and you want to have this information persisted sort of in a loosely word to another
Awesome.
service.
And another good example of that is if you're in a load balanced environment and you're using SignalR, you could use the Redis cache backplane, so you could have scale out in your web farm for SignalR hubs.
That's
You can do that as
awesome. Well, we are out of time. Thanks so much for talking about tooling, deploying, and making better your websites. We're here at Ignite 2015, sneaking in some dev stuff. Thanks for watching, and we'll catch you next time. Take care.